This is Julia James Davis, and welcome to The War on Beauty. The stripping of beauty in our modern world is not only severely regressive aesthetically, but it's actually a sign of a return to an animal state. And that might sound crazy until you look at our behavior, how our behavior has changed since these aesthetic changes were implemented all over our country and the whole West. We went from flourish in design to the pure white boxification of everything. And our behavior, along with this new style of design, has become more primitive, more materialistic, and more violent. And the less free we have become. We've kind of become slaves to our senses, and in a way, less free in a political way as well. The design revolution that occurred after World War I, and especially after World War II with the advent of modern architecture and contemporary art, was an attack on traditional beauty, which in the aftermath of the war came to really be associated with old values and old systems of rule. That was not just an attack on beauty itself, but it was an attack on transcendence and on true liberty, which these three principles are actually inseparably connected. I just finished these two books on the aesthetic education of man by Friedrich Schiller and From Bauhaus to Our House by Tom Wolfe. And although these two books were written 186 years apart, the first one by Friedrich Schiller in 1795 and the second in 1981, I actually think there's a very, very interesting connection between these two books, which explains kind of our dismal contemporary state of affairs, not just in the aesthetic sense, but also politically, culturally, and also our personal decline that has occurred in the West with this erasure of beauty, which of course this whole channel is dedicated to getting to the bottom of. Firstly, I want to explain Schiller's theory laid out in his book, because I think that this actually might be the most interesting book on beauty and aesthetics I have ever read, and I highly, highly recommend it. It's written as a series of letters to a patron at the kind of conclusion of the French Revolution. Schiller aims to explain how the political issues of their day can actually only be solved by the beautiful, and that man's happiness and wholeness, and therefore society's function and success, depends on the cultivation of the aesthetic. Schiller bases all of this argument off of the fact that he says there are two extreme natures within man. One is the sensual physical nature, and the other is the rational moral nature. Constantly in tension with these two extremes, man is kind of in this state of incompleteness, and he's either a savage on the one end or a barbarian on the other. Society at this time, which Schiller was writing kind of at the end of the Enlightenment, was made up of these two extremes in his view. One, the savage, underdeveloped lower classes, and second, the enlightened upper class, which in his view was no better. And because of this fragmented inner state of the people, the state itself was also corrupted, the political state. So it kind of created this situation where people hated the state, and then also the state didn't care about the people. So it was a vicious cycle leading to a loss of happiness, and most importantly, in Schiller's view, a loss of liberty. It's really interesting because Schiller says that the only culture that ever really achieved unity in these two extremes of the sensual and the rational was the ancient Greeks, but that the Greeks had basically maxed out the unity of the sensual and rational and had to necessarily fragment and split in order to progress. So therefore, man became more rational, more empirical, and more in his thinking, and less in his heart and his emotions. Man, essentially, in Schiller's view, couldn't progress without this splitting occurring, which was the driver of culture, but ultimately led to its suffering. So that's the two natures of men, but kind of the important part in Schiller's whole thesis here was that the only way to unify these conflicting natures within man and ultimately to improve the state was for man to become aesthetic. Because Schiller posits that beauty not only refines man, it's an ennobling force, but it's actually only in beauty that man achieves his highest expansion and is truly set free. So Schiller describes how the formal instinct is ultimately something that comes from the rational and is the necessary catalyst for freeing man from being a slave to the sensuous, which really limits and chains man to time and mere materiality. But man can't make the jump from the purely sensuous state to the rational very easily. That actually is impossible. So there has to be a transition state between the two extremes, which Schiller says is the aesthetic state. This state then becomes a means of leading man from matter to form, from feeling to laws, from a limited existence to an absolute existence. Man's goal, to Schiller, is to simultaneously feel as matter and to know himself as spirit. And it's only in beauty that these two conflicting and honestly mutually exclusive states exist at once. It is in this aesthetic state that man is made whole and complete, while at the same time his twofold nature is also not diminished, but even developed, which is really interesting. So he says that the aesthetic state is a situation of both and, not either or. But the very, very interesting thing about this theory is how it all ties into liberty. He says in a brilliant summation of his theory, as soon as we remember that freedom is taken from man by the one-sided compulsion of nature and feeling, and by the exclusive legislation of the reason in thinking, we must consider the capacity restored to him by the aesthetical disposition as the highest of all gifts, as the gift of humanity. I admit that he possesses this capacity for humanity before every definite determination in which he may be placed. But, as a matter of fact, he loses it with every determined condition into which he may come. And if he is to pass over to an opposite condition, humanity must be, in every case, restored to him by the aesthetic life. It is therefore not only a poetical license, but also philosophically correct when beauty is named our second creator. So liberty can't birth liberty, and morality can't birth liberty either. So only the aesthetic can lead to liberty because, again, the aesthetic is the transcendent third. So not only is freedom taken from man in his purely sensuous and his purely rational states, and only regained in the aesthetic state, but beauty in a very important way shapes us, especially morally. And it does so purely by form and not by substance. He says, one of the most important tasks of culture then is to submit man to form, even in a purely physical life, and to render it aesthetic, as far as the domain of the beautiful can be extended, for it is alone in the aesthetic state, and not in the physical state, that the moral state can be developed. And this to me is so notable because we can see that this is true. We can see that this absolutely worked out to be true when we look at our present day situation. Everything is ugly, and at the same time, our liberty is declining as the ugliness increases. And as the ugliness increases, so does immorality and kind of enslavement to the physical. Schiller, no doubt, would come to our present day times in 2025, and he would probably say that we are living in a savage state. Because Schiller describes man before being liberated by beauty, and it perfectly describes us now. He says, "What is man before beauty liberates him from free pleasure, and the serenity of form tames down the savageness of life? Eternally uniform in his aims, eternally changing in his judgments, self-seeking without being himself, unfettered without being free, a slave without serving any rule. Ignorant of his own dignity, he is far removed from honoring it in others, and conscious of his own savage greed, he fears it in every creature that he sees like himself. He never sees others in himself, only himself and others." I think that this perfectly describes how we are now, which is so paranoid and also really narcissistic on the individual and on the whole. So I really have got to limit the amount of quotes that I use from this book because it actually could not be more relevant to today. So again, I highly recommend that you read it, but I will wrap it all up with the summary of Schiller's thesis, kind of the conclusion of all of this, with his very important explanation of how beauty is the mark of civilized humanity. What phenomenon, he says, accompanies the initiation of the savage into humanity? However far we look back into history, the phenomenon is identical among all people who have shaken off the slavery of the animal state, the love of appearance, the inclination for dress and for games. So it is only when man has his immediate survival needs met with enough food, shelter, water, all that stuff, that he is actually able to enjoy beyond and to create beyond his immediate needs. From that state of superabundance, as Schiller calls it, he is able then to enter a state of play. And it's from the state of play that beauty comes, and from there, liberty. Liberty is the end result because, again, it's by this excess energy and our own volition that we rise out of the survival state. And when man is aesthetic, the ideal of life can govern. And also importantly, I think I've said that everything is important, but really, really importantly, as man starts to beautify his own appearance and shaping his own surroundings, the way that he looks, then those surroundings begin to shape him. First exteriorly in his manners and his dress and his decor, etc. But then interiorly by bringing his dual nature into harmony, because again, that is the effect of beauty. So with this in mind, we can look at the post-war stripping of all ornamentation and beauty really as a stripping of humanity and an abdication of the state of play back to a splintered state of pure rationality and pure physicality. And as our surroundings became 100% functional and 0% beautiful, this in turn had a shaping effect on people and on society. So this ties into the next book, which was a little bit more readable, but equally so interesting, From Bauhaus to Our House by Tom Wolfe. It was about the rise of Bauhaus in the post-war West and its origins in this socialist and quasi-communist political ideology, which wished to shape Europe, as they said in their own words, starting from zero. A new world completely reshaped through this socialistic and fervently non-bourgeois, entirely rational point of view. The starting from zero reshaping of the new world was to occur through the vehicle of aesthetics, through art and through architecture, and also through music. This is because all of the problems that had led to this moment in time were pinned on the bourgeois and the nobility of Europe. And it is actually a moment that was very interestingly similar to the French Revolution, what Friedrich Schiller was directly addressing in his letters. But where Schiller's solution to liberty and social improvement was through an increase of beauty, the Bauhaus solution was the abject opposite. It was through the literal stripping of beauty. So the Bauhaus and other similar avant-garde art movements that came up during the same time, they were all very, very socialist and pro-proletariat. And because the reigning pre-war nobility were very much connected to traditional beauty and lots of ornamentation, these new modernist schools of design and art proclaimed that they were going to be the opposite aesthetically, all the way down to forbidding pitched roofs, which they associated with the crowns of royalty. Only flat roofs were sufficiently anti-bourgeois. Not only that, but intricate facades were also eschewed for glass and steel flat-fronted buildings. All the hand-done masonry was swapped for machine-made materials, and private rooms were abolished for communal spaces and open floor plans. What happened here was, instead of beauty as truth incarnate, these modernist buildings were political theories incarnate. But as usually happens though with these kinds of revolutions, the aim in which they set out to achieve actually resulted in the complete opposite situation. The anti-bourgeois artists and thinkers became the new bourgeois, as a lot of these architects were promptly installed as department heads at all the best universities in the country. The pro-proletariat worker sentiment actually stripped jobs, as everything in these buildings was made by machine because that was more fair. And the buildings designed as modern worker housing actually became housing for either, on the one hand, people who were on welfare and didn't work at all, or for kind of the yuppies who worked at Exxon or any other big corporation. And notably, those were the only people who could actually afford the very proletariat price of $550 for a Mies van der Rohe Barcelona chair, which by 1981, when this book was written, had risen to $3,465 and could only be procured through a decorator. The thing is though, just as we learned from Schiller, to attempt to remake and better society by plunging entirely into logic and rationality in a very severe way of being is actually a surefire way to be unsuccessful. Because if you go that extreme way, which is what the modernist ideology was, it was extreme, you are splintered and necessarily incomplete. It was so purely conceptual that Tom Wolfe said it birthed another phenomenon, the famous architect who did little or no building. As Le Corbusier, or Corbu as Wolfe calls him, professed, the houses he designed were machines for living. And this is interesting, but maybe not surprising considering Schiller's theory that as everything got more and more mechanized and less human, the more and more that split deepened and we became increasingly identified with our physical and sensual selves, driven by food, by sex, by violence, and the procurement of things in a very survivalist manner. We've also become, as Schiller could probably predict, more and more siloed and stratified, with our individual worth being calculated as a measure of our output. So the same paradox is really occurring that he described in his own time, wherein we are self-seeking without really knowing ourselves or being ourselves. were unfettered without actually being free and were slaves without serving any rule. But there actually is, interestingly, a new rule here, because instead of learning from and improving on the failings of the ancien regime, the modernists and the postmodernists just took everything that old system had and inverted it. So instead of the religion of Christian faith and morality, they just replaced it with a new one. Wolff describes the modernist movement, not coincidentally, in very religious terms. Le Corbusier was the new Aquinas, the architecture departments were the new cloister, and the Modernist Manifesto was the new scripture. So to be accused of monotony then, which was a very easy thing to say about this new aesthetic, actually became the highest of compliments to these new architects. Wolff says, what did it matter if they said you were imitating Mies or Gropius or Corbu or any of the rest? It was like accusing a Christian of imitating Jesus Christ. And of course, these structures were so replicable because of how severely simple they were in design. In Mies van der Rohe's own words, "Less is more. My architecture is almost nothing." But let's tie this all back into what I said at the very beginning. If the sign of moving from the animal state to humanity, to a civilized humanity, begins when man begins embellishing his appearance and his surroundings, then is not the stripping of all embellishment the return to an animal state? Freedom and expansion result from beauty, and therefore a new type of tyranny and restriction has actually been implemented with this new type of minimalist modernist design. And again, as this has happened, we've seen such a clampdown on our own personal freedoms as well, and I don't think that that is accidental. But I really think that the only way out of our present day predicament, and I should probably say predicaments because there's a lot of them, is the reintroduction of true beauty, which is to say true harmony and unification, not just on an individual level, but also on the collective level as well. Aesthetic communication alone unites society, as Schiller said. So I want to end with an example, and perhaps the only example of truly unified beauty, which is the Catholic Church. From the high Gothic cathedrals to the angelic Gregorian chants to the wonders of the Renaissance, the Church has produced directly and indirectly the most incredible feats of beauty in the world. I think that even Schiller might admit that a Bernini sculpture is better than anything seen in ancient Greece. It could be said that the reason the Church is so intensely beautiful is because it contains so much paradox. And of course, all of this based upon the supreme unification of two extremes in Jesus Christ, the Logos, the Word made flesh, the King of the universe coming into the supremely humble form of a human infant lying in a manger. But think too about the other paradoxes of the Church. For example, the sumptuous ornamental beauty of the vestments and the architecture and the Mass, but also the commitment of many of its members to strict poverty and chastity, and also the profound spiritual experiences of saints like Saint Teresa, contrasted with the supremely intellectual minds of saints like St. Thomas Aquinas. And I could really go on and on. But I think it's this harmony and this unification that birthed, really not coincidentally, the highest and most beautiful culture, which became the ultimate civilizing force in all of history. I think that the Catholic Church is the perfect example of that unity, an even better example than Schiller cites in ancient Greece. So that is the whole video. I think that this one is going to turn out to be a pretty long one, but I absolutely loved these two books, especially read together. I think that they give you a lot to think about because Schiller's words, although written probably at this point, I'm not good at math, but like 200 years ago, are more relevant than ever. And we can see when he's writing during the French Revolution, these types of political situations happen over and over and over again. Everything is just a cycle and there's really nothing new under the sun. Also, Tom Wolfe's book is so funny and so spot on and so true and so interesting. So that is about how our lack of beauty, our lack of ornamentation has actually led us back to a savage state of existence. And I would love to know your thoughts in the comments. And please do subscribe so that you don't miss out on any future War on Beauty videos. We talk all about the erasure of beauty in the West and the importance of the return of beauty through a foundation in Jesus and the Catholic Church and faith. And I thank you so much for watching.